Thank you, Shellye. And so you actually brought up a very interesting question about consumers and farmers and some of the tensions in there. Maybe Ankita, you can start. Can you discuss the role of consumers and farmers in technology push and market pull and how that influences your approach to design? Is it possible to achieve solutions that are good for both farmers and consumers?
Yeah, that's a pretty tough question, I think, because as Shellye pointed out, there are sometimes tensions between what consumers want and what farmers want. And so at least the approach that we've been taking is the participatory design approach, where we bring different kinds of food system stakeholders to the table so we can think through a little bit more deeply what each of the different types of stakeholder needs are and how we can then start to do a little bit of negotiation between each of those things, right? At the end of the day, technology tends to mediate these kinds of conversations. And so in my mind, this is an opportunity for us to then start to think critically about how we can design technology specifically to help mediate those types of tensions. One of the things that we see from the consumer end is sort of this interest in provenance. And so there's this like burden on record keeping for farmers. And so on the farmer end, we're seeing an interest in adopting more sustainable ag practices. And so that's an example of one of those spaces where, there's something that consumers want, there's something that farmers want, and there's this interesting space in between where in our case, when it comes to thinking about the design of tech, we're then trying to think about how do we ensure data traceability and transparency while still respecting the rights and responsibilities of different types of stakeholder groups. And so, at the end of the day, we then think about it in terms of, okay, what are the specific types of tools we can then build that help address some of these things? The cover crops work would be an example of that, right? That was a specific tool that was supposed to be able to help farmers be able to adopt a sustainable ag practice, which is then a response to sort of a consumer desire, which is for food that is grown more sustainably. So that's at least an approach that we've been taking.
So Jenna, Ceres Imaging is dealing with the farmer as consumer, who also has a responsibility to consumers, and remote sensing can be perceived as this eye in the sky or big brother type surveillance. So how do you view this push-pull dynamic?
Yeah, I'm glad you noted that as our consumer, as we're a business-to-business solution, our consumer is the farmer. But when we think of the consumer, we think of all of us, right? We all eat food. And so thinking along those lines, as we use remote sensing originally to help farmers save water and resources and become more efficient, I think there's certainly ways that have manifested that are trickling down to all of us who are purchasing food. Specifically with using imagery and flexing it to help be more precise in how farmers are using fertilizer applications, right? So where I've seen imagery used widely for that is identifying areas where, shoot, I only need to use this fertilizer application on one set instead of the whole field. So one set being maybe 10 acres of a 100 or 1,000 acre ranch, or even better, especially on the wine grape side, we see a lot of vineyard management groups or wineries looking at their vines through the imagery and recognizing, actually, my vines look really good and I don't need to do this spray anymore. And I think, I don't really see a market demand yet for low water. I mean, we all talk about it and we all think it's nice, but I don't think we really see the market calling for that yet. But we certainly recognize like the boom in organic production, right? And I think that's what we're really seeing in the use for imagery, which is exciting because one, it's great for all of us if we're consuming food that has maybe no sprays or minimal sprays. But that also helps that farmer, right? It helps that farmer save tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on their size of an organization. So I think that's a really great example of where we can use a solution that's good for us as a business, but it's good for our consumer, the farmer, and then it's good for the consumer of all of that, which is us.
So I'm going to transition a bit. The pandemic was brought up and it's pretty hard to ignore in our current life. And the COVID-19 pandemic exposed some holes in the food system, but it also revealed some surprising resilience as well. So what are the opportunities and emerging tech trends in building and supporting resilient future food systems? Shellye, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think, there's definitely a possibility and information on where markets are. So that's literal markets and figurative markets. Anecdotally, I know that there's a decent portion of the supply chain that is still run by folks who do much of their business through phone calls and long-term relationships. And so I wonder if there's opportunity for technology to assist in any challenges these individuals might face on really connecting to food and agricultural sectors that have accepted technology and they still may be struggling with. So in instances, we have these unfortunate events, everyone is able to pivot and kind of have technological uptake all at the same time.
Ankita, you think a lot about resilience. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So one of the things that at least struck us during the early days of the pandemic, right, is that, we saw these massive infrastructural challenges. We were reading about food waste and people throwing milk and all these massive supply chain disruptions that were happening. And one of the things that stood out to me was there was the local food systems were in some ways, they shone as this like bastion of resilience. And so when I think about like what makes these systems resilient, there are a couple of key pieces, right? And resiliency literature tells us what these are. And they include sort of people being able to self-organize, people having agency over their food systems, people being able to sort of respond to these different shocks. And so it's sort of like with this sort of idea, we started this project, right, the Resilient Foods Project that I mentioned earlier, in which we were trying to think about how can we empower communities to be able to be more resilient, right? So how do we highlight some of these strengths in local food systems and then bridge the gaps in sort of information and food flows from farm to fork? And so what we saw last year, we did a lot of ethnographic work. We're talking to a lot of folks who work with farmers, work with food coordinators, and so on. And we saw this sort of like full stack need for technology, right? People were looking for mapping tools, for coordination tools. There was a need for interoperability among tools. There was a need for improved usability in existing marketplace tools. It's sort of one of those things where every time I have the opportunity to speak to sort of my home crowd of technologists and folks who are on the HCI side, I always say, guys, there's a humongous need for our skill set in local food systems. Let us bring our skills to bear on these meaningful, impactful problems that at least we see in local food systems. And so that's at least what we focus on in my lab because of that. And it's something that, the pandemic highlighted, but has also now laid the foundation for us to then start to do something to be able to strengthen local food.
So I think that's a fantastic way to end this discussion and why all of the innovators in this meeting should consider turning their talent toward ag food tech. It is the basis of life after all. Thank you all panelists very much for joining us. That was fantastic. We'll hand it back over to Camille.
Great, thank you, Erin. And thank you so much, panelists. We really appreciated Ankita, Jenna, and Shellye. It was tremendous to hear the passion in your voices behind what you do, and that's always really inspiring.